Mrs. Buttkiss had a big problem. She had a terrible case of gas forever, and she was afraid to let it out because she had no idea what would happen. Mrs. Buttkiss was a very large woman. She also had a humongous butt. So she worried that there would be a huge explosion if she ever farted after holding it in for all these years. Mr. Buttkiss didn't live with Mrs. Buttkiss anymore. He moved out because he too was afraid of what would happen when she couldn't hold it in any longer, and he didn't know how to help her. They didn't have kids, so Mrs. Buttkiss lived, except for her Peekapoo Shamimi dog, who loved her with no ifs, ands, or buts. So this is sad, dude. She is not happy. She's been dumped by this guy. And she still has gas, and she still doesn't know what's going to happen. People often stopped and stared when Mrs. Buttkiss walked by because she was so huge. They didn't know about her problem. She kept it to herself. And Mrs. Buttkiss liked to eat. She also liked to shop. Every Tuesday, she would walk to the grocery and fill 2 carts with food, then go home to eat. On this particular Tuesday, she was filling her second cart, and she had just entered the fruit aisle. Suddenly, an irresistible urge came over her. Can you guess what she wanted to do? What she needed to do? As she passed the cantaloupes, Mrs. Buttkiss finally let go. Dress is flying up. Years and years of fart escaped with a tremendous blast, and the sound was deafening. It was the loudest and longest fart ever recorded in history. The supermarket shook. Food fell to the floor. People yelled, unsure of what had happened. The smell began to spread. It seemed like a mixture of rotten eggs and dead skunks and old poo. Customers tried to run towards the door, but no one made it. Everyone in the store fainted before they could escape. Except Mrs. Buttkiss. She stood as still as a statue, watching the commotion around her. She couldn't smell her own fart, but she saw what it did to everyone else. She was scared, so she left her shopping cart, slowly moved around all the people who had passed out, and headed towards the exit. Like you and I did when we burned that apartment complex down. Once back in her apartment, Mrs. Buttkiss felt wonderful. Her stomach felt relieved too. She couldn't believe that she hadn't farted years ago. About the same time, people began to awaken in the grocery store. One by one, they stood up and looked around. The store smelled awful, but something else had happened. Mommy, look at the pineapple. Every fruit had changed color. The pears were blue.
Oh my God.
Lemons were red, oranges green, apples were orange, and white polka dots. Cherries were yellow, bananas were purple with the yellow stripes. Plums were white. Customers ran for the beautiful fruit and began piling it into their shopping carts. In just a few minutes, the shelves were bare. Long lines quickly formed at the checkout counter. The store manager knew what had happened. The big lady's fart had changed the color of the fruit. He had to find her to make more of it, but nobody knew where she was. Word spread around town about the fruit, and the next day, hundreds of people rushed to the store to buy it. Determined to find Mrs. Buttkiss, the manager posted a sign on the window, "Please come back, fart woman." A week later, when she thought nobody would remember her or the trouble she caused, Mrs. Buttkiss returned to the grocery to shop. The sign on the door stopped her in her tracks. She knew it was written about her. They're really mad at me, she thought. Mrs. Buttkiss went in timidly and asked for the manager. When he appeared, she told him, "My name is Mrs. Buttkiss. I was the one who farted last week. I'm very sorry." The manager gave her a big hug. the best he could because he was a small man and she was a large woman. "Thank you for coming back," he gushed. "We're out of colored fruit." But Mrs. Buttkiss was confused. The manager explained that her fart changed the color of the fruit. It tasted better, and every customer was begging for more. You'll never guess what happened next. The manager offered Mrs. Buttkiss a job farting in the store at night. That way, nobody would faint, and she could color the fruit. "I can sell your fruit for 3 times the price of regular fruit, and I can pay you very well," the manager promised. I bet this is well received. It is. By God, there you go. Mrs. Buttkiss decided to take the job. Now she goes to the store every night after dinner, farts in the fruit aisle, and when she sees the bananas, grapes, pineapples, oranges, plums, melons, and lemons and limes change color, her work is done. The customers are happy, the manager is happy, and Mrs. Buttkiss is very, very happy. No shit.
Yeah.
And it comes with a Mrs. Buttkiss whoopee cushion. There it is.